been a while since I've taken the time to really gush about a movie on this channel. No academic thesis, no inflammatory title, just talking about a movie I like and why I like it. This is partly because it's been a while since I watched a movie that changed my life. The last time that happened was probably Sex, Lies, and Videotape, which I saw for the first time about a year and a half ago at this point. Shortly after, lockdown happened, and you'd think that would have been the perfect time to watch more life-changing movies, but, that didn't happen. That's not to say I haven't been watching a lot of movies, though, and from what I've observed in the past year and a half, I've been able to compile a list of simple criteria that constitute a great movie. Those criteria are a bunch of cool shit, some fucking zingers, and Paul Bettany playing the cello. Unfortunately, only one movie in recorded history satisfies all three criteria, and that movie is Master and Commander: The Far Side of the World. I've been aware of this movie for quite some time. It's not exactly an indie darling, but some recent Dudes Rock discourse and Russell Crowe's own online presence have had me unable to stop thinking about it. So when I saw some friends I made a pact with to watch it post-vaccination, I transcended. And then like 2 weeks later, they announced they're gonna make another Master and Commander movie, which I can only assume I played a role in. Right off the bat, I have to commend the film's approach to titles. Based on the Aubrey-maturin book series, this film is not Master and Commander with the subtitle The Far Side of the World. The colon is simply separating the title into the two stories it primarily pulls from, Master and Commander and The Far Side of the World. Much like how Aubrey-maturin is just Aubrey and Maturin's names, but hyphenated. It seems silly to point out, but I do think the simplicity of it is brilliant. Not to mention an uncommon use for a colon, and, most importantly, it foreshadows the film's approach to setting up dichotomies upon dichotomies on multiple levels. Had they made more movies like they planned, I'm sure Master and Commander would have been the umbrella name, like Game of Thrones. But seeing as how at this present moment, only the one movie exists, I'm gonna read into it how I want. Another thing that's uncommon and brilliant is how each character is credited by both name and crew position. Not only does this cater to the film's commitment to royal etiquette, but it also gives us a whole bunch of fun words. Refer to criterion number 1. For instance, Billy Boyd plays Barrett Bondin, Coxswain. I love Coxswain. I love the way Coxswain feels in my mouth. And that's to say nothing of the fact that he's played by Billy Boyd, that his name is Barrett Bondin, or that Billy Boyd and Barrett Bondin have the same alliteration. We also have some midshipmen, some other swains in addition to Coxswain, and a whole bunch of seamen. Look, it's Ken Tanaka from Glee. I think this film really understands the acoustic satisfaction behind nautical terminology, in addition to the aesthetic satisfaction. There's a scene where Aubrey's teaching the kids how to use sextants, and then he says the word sexton, and you really get the sense that the film just wanted to hear him say it.
Williamson, look to your sextant.
And who wouldn't? Sexton's a great word. I've said it 3 times now. This is the kind of film where everything plays into everything else, tonally and thematically, and that's why I think it works so well that the film is constructed like a biblical series of parables. At the largest scale, we have the chase. The HMS Surprise is chasing the French Acheron. The plot is that simple, and yet it reveals depths upon depths within that simplicity, much like the ocean has depths. Coincidence? On a slightly smaller scale, Maturin wants to discover new animals in the Galapagos, which is the main source of the push and pull with this chase. These two pursuits also reflect the dichotomy between the two men. Maturin's goal is science and progress, and Aubrey's goal is patriotism and leadership. But within this setup, we have a series of episodes that each have their own implications on the ideals of leadership and allegiance Aubrey and Maturin are debating throughout the film. Most notable is the parable of Hallam. The crew is faced with a stretch of no wind, so they blame it on a curse. Hallam has been exercising some lackluster leadership lately, so they scapegoat him as the source of the curse. Tensions increase, Aubrey tries to coach him through being an authoritative but charismatic leader, and deciding he is unfit, he throws himself off the ship. Just as Aubrey admonishes the crew for driving Hallam to such lengths, the skies open up, and the ship has the wind to continue sailing. There's no voice of God here. The man of science could sufficiently chalk it up to coincidence, but the man of the sea could just as sufficiently point to it as support of his superstition, which in turn feeds into the accepted naval dynamics of duty and authority. In other words, the film operates on the same level as the sailors, and not only respects the mysticism of sea life, but puts it in a respectable real-world context, as opposed to something like Pirates of the Caribbean, which operates itself like a piece of folklore. For the record, Another phenomenal movie, and only 2003's second best ship-centric movie by a narrow margin. In any case, instances like the Parable of Hallam have their own episodic qualities, and this one probably feels particularly biblical because they're constantly referencing Jonah and the whale, but they're not only thematically relevant to Aubrey-maturin's philosophizing, they play an active role in shaping that discussion. The net result is simultaneously a vignette of life at sea and a gradually complicating meditation on, again, duty and authority. This is why it's frustrating to see fans of the books call the movie a watered-down mishmash of 6 subplots or a maltreatment of the Aubrey and Maturin characters. I get that the books are beloved, and I've been known to take adaptational changes harshly, but the changes here aren't just for the sake of blockbuster spectacle, or for the sake of cramming as much as they can into one movie, or, God forbid, shock value for fans of the books. In a sprawling 20-installment book series, one's life's work, it makes sense that the characters are lived in and contradictory with plenty of overlap, but in a 2.5-hour film, complexity comes from simplicity. For instance, in the books, Aubrey is much more charismatic and wouldn't think twice about stopping the ship to jump in and save one of his sailors, devising a tactic to afford the halt later on. Likewise, Maturin is much more outward and leaderly than his film counterpart, often leading expeditions himself. Giving the characters in the movies these qualities, however, would muddle up the character foil, and more importantly, the thematic debate. There has to be some push and pull, and in a feature film it has to be expedited. Had Aubrey stopped the ship to save a sailor in the movie, and cleverly devised a tactic to afford it, what would that say about their debate? That Aubrey's a smart captain? We already know that. We already see his clever tactics, and the film is much more interested in the cost of authority and the corruption of power and obsession. And this applies to the little episodes as well. The film is much more than the sum of its parts. Key example. They're explicitly talking about these themes at dinner, and in a display of jovial authority, Aubrey pulls a fast one on Maturin.
Do you see those 2 weevils, Doctor? Which would you choose?
I would choose the right-hand weevil. It has significant advantage in both length and breadth.
There, I have you. You're completely dished. Do you not know that in the service, one must always choose the lesser of 2 weevils?
What we're essentially looking at is Maturin getting Joe Mahmoud, which, see criterion number 2. But of all things, the lesser of 2 evils. Not only is this explicitly about the cost of war and difficult decisions, but I think it's also about rooting for the British military, historical villains, in one of the few rare contexts where they're the underdog against a greater dictatorial force, as further coded by the size of their ships. Apparently in the book, they're chasing an American ship, which seems to have informed the plot point that the Akron was built in the US, so they know its layout, and that opens up a whole other discussion about the lesser of 2 evils. But facing off against Napoleonic forces certainly complicates the geopolitical matter of rooting for the British. In a sense, though, the enemy is irrelevant, as the French are mostly portrayed as a faceless force, rendering them an abstract conception of enemy that could easily be swapped out with a different country. I mean, it already was swapped out with a different country. There's a scene where Aubrey goes into the Acheron's great cabin and sees that the enemy is more like them than he thought. The French horn is a little on the nose, but I think this is a notion that again applies to the abstract idea of enemy rather than making a connection between the British and the French specifically. And I have to commend the efficiency of imbuing the horn with this connection. It's much more resonant and universal than if Aubrey had sat down with a Frenchman and discussed commonalities. And this is something else that plays into the film's insistence on upholding royal standards, which leads me to what I believe is Peter Weir's greatest aesthetic and thematic fascination. I'm trying to keep this video loose, but if you're looking for a thesis, this is it. Actually, that's not true. The thesis here is that Master and Commander is the greatest film of the 21st century. But this is a sub-thesis. The image of elaborate period fashion in an impractical environment. I've only seen 4 Peter Weir films, arguably his most mainstream films, but they each revolve around this image aesthetically and thematically. For one, it's just a striking visual. In the age of SPF-imbued clothing, it's nice to see period costume in the wilderness or on the beach. I've never been to the Galapagos, but when Paul Bettany walks out wearing this to go catalog some undiscovered species, I can't imagine what else someone should wear to the Galapagos. Part of the beauty of the aesthetic is the fact that it's impractical, that it seemingly doesn't belong in this environment, and this sensibility has seemingly followed Weir throughout his whole career. We have that sublime scene from Dead Poets Society where Charlie plays the saxophone in a cave. Saxophones don't belong in caves. The Truman Show is full of anachronistic attire, and Picnic at Hanging Rock explores this to the highest degree. That film is all about the oppressive attire. The irony of being permitted to remove their gloves on a sweltering day. The rebellion of removing stockings and shoes. It's clothing, but it's indicative of the institutional authority, the man-made structure, juxtaposed with hypnotic natural life, the flora and fauna, as well as the mystical force of nature, Hanging Rock itself, a white whale of sorts. In all of these films, the attire represents institutional oppression. Dead Poets from the boarding school, Truman Show from the production company, I guess, or maybe Hollywood, and Master and Commander from the aristocracy. Weir approaches the Galapagos with the same mysticism he approaches Hanging Rock with, the flightless bird being Maturin's white whale. But Aubrey has a white whale of his own, the Acheron, which for the record is also imbued with mysticism, and Maturin is unable to finish his pursuit. Here, Weir is doing two things. One, he's asserting that the more white whales a story has, the better. In fact, is it any coincidence that they disguise the surprise as a whaling ship to catch the white whale? Or that in their pursuit they enact a whale-centric Bible story? I mean, maybe. I think whales were a little more prominent in 1805. But maybe not. The second thing Weir is doing is applying the same dichotomy of nature versus institution from Hanging Rock to this situation, which is fascinating because in the debate of, say, the Hallam Curse, Maturin's man of science perspective represents education from the institution, whereas the man of the sea perspective represents education from nature. But Aubrey's goal of taking down the Acheron is that of the institution, whereas Maturin's still science-backed goal of cataloging new species is that of nature. He's quite literally a naturalist, and the sailors, our everymen, are servants to the institution. But Maturin's goal could still be seen as that of the institution, as he's bringing information on nature into society, in which case they're all servants to the institution, granted on different socioeconomic levels. Notice how their final plan was inspired by nature, continuing this thematic bridging.
I had no idea that a study of nature could advance the art of naval warfare.
So this idea of clothing could be seen as allegiance via etiquette.
Someone offered him a boat cloak on a cold night, and he said no, he didn't need it. He was quite warm. His zeal for king and country kept him warm.
This would be consistent with the measures the crew takes to restore the ship. The amount of paint and spare parts in the place of food or other rations they could have carried, the labor that goes into just restoring the masthead, for instance, is completely impractical, but it's fully in service of British nationalism, a display of unchecked hubris, much like the hubris Maturin accuses Aubrey of displaying just by virtue of continuing the chase. The Shakespearean musings about the ship being in its prime when it appears to be in its worst state, how this applies to the crew and illustrates the ship as a symbol for so many different things. Crowe himself has talked about themes of fidelity to empire no matter what the cost, though I'm not sure if he views it as a good or a bad thing. But that's because the film doesn't posit it as either. The whole idea is about reckoning with the ethics of this pursuit. For this reason, the stick-bug plan is additionally thematically appropriate in the sense that the means by which they end up engaging the Acheron are undercover without the ability to announce allegiance to the king. Well, until they do. And if we're still assigning characters to institution or nature, I think it also checks out that the nature-inspired plan is a form of espionage, which is naturalist Maturin's other main gig, despite how little mention it gets in the movie, and of course this being the side of the dichotomy that questions unbridled allegiance, uncoincidentally an Irish perspective in a British conquest. There is irony in the fact that it would still be a victory for the British aristocracy, despite having to cover up nationalist fanfare, but I think the most brilliant decision in the film is that they don't fully defeat the French. The enemy still has one leg up on them, and the chase is still on. The white whale is still out there. Both of them, in fact, as solidified by this all-time closing line.
Well, Stephen, the bird's flightless.
Yes.
It's not going anywhere.
Talk about a fucking zinger. And with that, I'm expelling the word zinger from my vocabulary. But this cements the film as I said before, a window into the trials of life at sea, unfathomable hardships like sacrificing your Galapagos specimens in the name of battle, while simultaneously illustrating a very linear philosophical debate, which we can surmise is just one small bite out of the apple that is sea life. And all of this is presented in the midst of genuine blockbuster spectacle, and more importantly, the vibes. Because let's be honest with ourselves, On some level, these thematic ideas aren't really why people love the movie. They're fascinating and they inform the filmmaking decisions, but it's the audiovisual experience of the film that people are drawn to. No one has filmed a ship like this. I want you to point me to one other person who's filmed a ship like this. You can't, because it hasn't been done. Just like the flightless bird, just like the faceless enemy, just like Hanging Rock, Peter Weir and D.P. Russell Boyd filmed the HMS Surprise with intrigue and mysticism, almost like a science video illustrating the inside of a cell. It's equal parts man-made machine and mysterious force of nature, again being informed by the thematic dichotomy at play, but more importantly looking like a nautical oil painting. Computer effects are used sparingly, and it's noticeable, but because it's so tastefully employed, it doesn't really date the film, and the practical action sequences are visceral and grounded. There's an artistry and choreography to Gore Verbinski's wacky action sequences, but because Master and Commander has to operate with real-world physics, each impact hits on a more gut level. And this is in no small part thanks to the sound design. It is loud, crisp, precise. I mean, I think it's worth noting that the film is PG-13, and yet it feels like such a gut-wrenching portrayal. There are brutal surgeries in this. Maturin replaces a sailor's skull fragment.
Those are his brains.
He removes a bullet from himself, and he amputates a kid's arm. We don't see the amputation, but the atmosphere, this kid's agonizing performance, and the illustrative sound design make us feel as though we have. It's the audiovisual experience and the bond between men. Crowe and Bettany both give masterful and commanding performances, and even without the philosophy of their debate, there's simple joy to be had in just watching how they interact. Sidebar, this film has a great approach to characterization where they just make every character as capable as possible. Blakeney, the kid who gets his arm amputated, for instance, proves to be a master insect cataloger at the Galapagos, which you think is already redemptive enough for the loss he's suffered, but then by the end of the film, he's captaining the ship through combat. Every time you think they've flexed Maturin's surgical abilities to the highest degree, he one-ups himself. Then he speaks fluent Portuguese, and fights the French along with the rest of the crew, and most importantly, plays the cello. Not only are these cello and violin scenes some cool shit, as long as you don't pay much attention to the bowing, but it's the very foundation of the central relationship. This is quite literally the externalization of these two are friends, which sounds like a given. We get that they're friends as they discuss everything about the story as it happens, and of course the series this is based on is Aubrey-maturin, but to give them a status quo activity like this elevates the level of intimacy, because at its base value, this serves the same function a sex scene does for a romantic relationship in a story, even paving way to this rom-com-esque breakup scene, while simultaneously illustrating the class difference on the ship and establishing the basis for the soundtrack. No other film has the gall to drop Yo-Yo Ma's performance of Bach's Cello Suite No. 1 in G major. Twice. I mean, come on. I don't want to risk dating this video by speculating on how good the new Master and Commander movie is going to be, but this one taps into something spiritual on such a meticulous level. It's not an experience that can be reproduced. So much of the experience of this film is the micro and macro scale of dichotomies, the mythological ethos, and the mysticism only Peter Weir is able to manifest. Whatever comes next will have to be a far aesthetic departure, or it'll be a shell of a movie. There is a wealth of source material, and reboots and remakes I've been skeptical about in the past have proven me wrong, but I don't know, this movie has everything. Except women. That's the one thing. On that note, I'm gonna wrap this up. Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World, pretty good movie. Links to my social media and Patreon are in the description of this video. Like, share, comment, subscribe, turn on notifications, draw a picture, ride a bike, I don't know, do what you want. I'll see you next time, and thanks for watching.